All right, thanks everyone. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge that we are based in and doing work in communities in the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the third in a series of online learning opportunities that are being coordinated by the regional coordinators of Maine's Community Resilience Partnership, along with working with a bunch of advisory partners and community partners. The series is called Building Stronger Communities. It's designed for communities enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership, those who are currently enrolling, and of course, those who are interested in enrolling. And we'll share more about the Community Resilience Partnership in just a moment. But first, I'll introduce myself and also my fellow presenters. So my name is Gabe McPhail. I serve as one of the regional coordinators in Region 1 of the Community Resilience Partnership. I work collaboratively with my colleagues at Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Greater Portland Council of Governments, and Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. Together, we are the Region 1 Coordinator Collaborative, and we also work with a stellar team of advisory partners. We support communities enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. We're based in York, Cumberland, Saginaw, Lincoln, and Knox County, as well as communities in southern Oxford County. So I just want to acknowledge that Yvette Meunier is also on the line. She is the Region 2 coordinator. Thanks for being with us, Yvette. And I will also say a thank you to our presenters who are joining us today. From the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation in the Future is Dr. Cassandra Rose, Senior Science Analyst and Climate Council Coordinator, and Karina Grader, Sustainability Coordinator at Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission. And Karina also serves with me as one of the Community Resilience Partnership Region 1 regional coordinators. So she's also part of the Region 1 Coordinator Collaborative. I don't think we have any folks joining from watch parties today, but thank you to community members who are here with us. We're really happy you're joining us. And again, just a reminder that we are recording this event. So before we launch in, the Zoom etiquette that we're all well aware of by now, hopefully, but just like to share. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we're going to hold those until the Q&A portion of the event. So if you could either put your questions in the chat or jot them down, we will get to them when we do our Q&A. So a quick overview of what we're going through today. I'll do a brief introduction. Then we're going to look at some climate science. We'll look at the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan, and then community projects that are focused on reducing emissions, cutting costs, and ways to mitigate climate change. So let's talk a few minutes about the Community Resilience Partnership, even though I know folks on the call are likely aware, in case folks who are watching this in the future may want to learn more about the partnership. So I'll just do a quick run through. So the Community Resilience Partnership, it's a program of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation in the Future, or GOPIF. The program is aligned with the Maine Won't Wait 4-year climate action plan. It helps Maine communities reduce emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change. The partnership provides both grant funding and direct support to municipal and tribal governments for climate mitigation and adaptation projects. And we'll talk in just a minute about climate adaptation and mitigation. So how does the partnership work? To receive benefits of the partnership, like grant funding and technical assistance, communities first need to enroll in the partnership. So oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So you can either enroll on your own as a community, or you can work with a service provider who is funded through the Community Resilience Partnership, and that service provider can help you enroll. So there are a bunch of steps to enrolling in the partnership. One of those steps is to do some assessments. There are a couple of assessments that your community needs to do just to see where you're at with your resilience in your community. There's a self-assessment, and there's also a checklist, which we'll get to in just a minute. Part of the enrollment process is holding at least one community workshop to identify what your community's climate priorities are, and then also for your municipal government to adopt a resolution of climate action. So the list of actions provided by the governor's office for this program, there are 72. They're based on the Maine Won't Wait climate action plan. As I mentioned earlier, they involve both mitigation and adaptation strategies. Today, we're going to focus on mitigation, climate mitigation strategies. So of this checklist, those are in areas of A, B, C, and D. So those strategies are embrace the future of transportation, modernize Maine's buildings, reduce emissions through clean energy. And we'll probably talk a little less about this today, if at all, but strategy D is to grow Maine jobs and protect natural resource industries. So all of those are related to energy in a bunch of different ways. So we're going to hear more about those in just a minute. So I want to just quickly share the benefits of joining the partnership. So once your community is enrolled, you're eligible to work with regional coordinators. That's me and Karina and Yvette and a bunch of other folks in the state serving different communities throughout the state. We provide you with support and project development coordination, access to technical assistance, training, help with grants, particularly those larger state and federal grants that are required to implement large-scale projects. So before we turn it over to our presenters, I just want to give a little framework and a little context. So let's talk a minute about resilience, because resilience often has a bunch of different meanings, and depending on who you're talking to, it might be referred to in a bunch of different ways. So for the sake of the work that we do in the Community Resilience Partnership, I like to define climate resilience as the ability of a community to anticipate, plan for, and mitigate or lessen the dangers and seize the opportunities associated with environmental and social change. So traditional definitions of resilience talk about a system's ability to bounce back in the face of a disaster or in the face of adversity. So we want to do better when we're in this program. We want to do better than the status quo. We want to make communities stronger. So that's why we prefer to say bounce forward versus bouncing back. And so throughout this Building Stronger Communities series, we'll be discussing how communities enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership are using partnership funds and partnership support to build stronger communities. And they take actions that involve both adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation and mitigation, both integral parts of climate resilience. And climate adaptation really refers to the ability of a system to prepare for and make adjustments to observed and anticipated impacts of climate change. And mitigation refers to strategies and actions that remove greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere or reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So today we're going to focus on climate science and what communities in the partnership are doing to mitigate climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions while creating efficiencies and cutting costs. Okay, so that is enough intro from me. And we'll begin our presentations. I'll go off screen share and I'm going to turn things over to Cassandra Rose. And just a quick reminder, any questions that you have, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and share slides. Okay, can you see the slide show? Now you can. Okay, great. I'll just pull over my Zoom window. There we are. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cassandra Rose. Thank you very much, Gabe, for inviting me to speak here with you and Karina today. I am the Senior Science Analyst and the Maine Climate Council Coordinator in the Governor's Office, Policy, Innovation, and the Future. So to begin with, I'm going to be putting my climate scientist hat on to speak a little bit about what science says about the impacts of climate change are in the state and what we need to be anticipating in the future. And then Karina and I will be talking together about Maine Won't Wait strategies to reduce emissions, primarily focusing on the first few strategies that Gabe really ably introduced before, and different examples of community action recommendations that communities can take to help achieve those statewide goals. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in. And please feel free to add any questions in the chat. I will take a look at the end of this section and then throughout to see what we can address. So as you have all doubtless heard, because you're here, Earth's climate is changing and warming today as a result of human activities. And the leading cause of that warming is rising greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide or CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere, which have gone up over 50% since the mid-1800s, primarily from burning fossil fuels. And the scientific consensus on this link between rising emissions and rising temperatures is extremely strong at 99%, which is on par with the understanding of the link between smoking and increased cancer risk for reference for the scientific consensus. And slowing down these greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere is critical for keeping warming and climate change to a minimum moving forward. Reducing emissions will also reduce the amount of adaptation that we're going to have to do as people and with our ecosystems in response to climate impacts over time. So while temperatures globally have increased about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius over time, Maine's land temperatures have increased even more quickly, going up over 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895, as you can see with this time series diagram here, going from more blue temperatures to much more warmer red temperatures in recent decades. And in that time, coastal areas have warmed more than the interior of the state, although the entire state is warming. And our winters are the fastest warming season in Maine, which has caused Maine's growing season to increase by about 2 weeks, and earlier lake ice outs and snowpack melt in the spring. In recent news, last year, 2021, was confirmed as Maine's second warmest year on record, alongside other notable climate records. Going to our ocean, we also see the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of the ocean, of the world ocean. It's warming faster than 99% of the rest of the ocean. And that also had its warmest year in 2021, which has a great number of impacts on the species and the fisheries that we depend on in Maine. And so fundamentally, this warming trend over time is cascading through Maine's physical environment and causing changes in all corners of the state. So that's the historical look at Maine's temperatures. When we think about warming in the future, it really is going to depend on humanity's ability to curb greenhouse gas emissions. On the left-hand side of this graph are historical Maine temperatures until 2020. This is actually exactly what we just saw on the last slide, just depicted in a line instead of bars. But the three colorful lines on the right-hand side show different potential future temperature pathways, depending on future greenhouse gas emissions, with the lowest emissions stabilizing net zero at 2050 here, and higher or business as usual emissions going up in red at the top line here. And so these pathways suggest that Maine may warm by an additional 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050, and up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit on average by 2100, depending again on our success in curbing greenhouse gas emissions globally. They make it clear that in the higher emission scenarios, green and the red lines, Maine's climate will be much hotter than if net zero emissions are achieved globally by mid-century, this blue line here. The shaded areas behind the lines also show that temperatures, and this is also true of precipitation, may become more variable in the future with extreme hot and extreme cold weather events occurring. And so this is why we talk about reducing emissions as being an important piece of the puzzle for minimizing the amount of adaptation to climate change impacts that we'll have to do in the future, because our future climate is going to very much depend on our emissions reductions today and in the coming decades. So as average temperatures rise in Maine, very hot or high heat index days will happen more frequently. These are these heat waves that we get in our warm months. The map on the right shows the current heat vulnerability throughout the state from the State Climate Plan's vulnerability analysis, with redder colors or darker colors showing higher vulnerability to heat by zip code. So high heat index days are likely to be 2 to 4 times more frequent by the 2050s with current climate trends, causing both indirect and direct costs from emergency room visits and hospital visits to medical costs to rise as well. Direct costs as the result of these more frequent high heat index days are expected to rise anywhere between 9 and 14 times higher by 2050 and 26 times higher by 2100, again, depending on what our emissions are doing and our temperatures are doing over the next century. However, as we saw this last week with an Arctic air outbreak across much of North America, we still need to plan for cold weather outbreaks, even with climate warming. According to the US National Climate Assessment, cold waves have also increased in the US over time. We're seeing that variability in temperatures increasing over time. And emergency room visit data compiled by the Maine CDC over the last 5 years show where cold illness related emergency room visits have been most common in Maine counties throughout the last 5 years. So it may seem a bit counterintuitive, but by knowing this, we know to plan for large extreme swings in Maine's extreme temperatures over time, both very warm as well as continued extreme cold. So warming is also causing Maine to become wetter overall, with statewide annual precipitation, our rain or snow and snowfall, increasing by 6 inches on average since 1895, which is a pretty big increase over time. With greater warming can also come more unpredictable rainfall and snowfall, with both short-term droughts and more frequent severe storms striking without much warning, sometimes even within the same year. Heavy storms of 1 to 4 inches of precipitation are becoming more frequent, which increases the probability of floods and smaller watersheds that can erode infrastructure and degrade water quality in wells and public water sources, ponds, lakes, streams, and so on. The pictures in this slide show the impacts of several storms that have affected Maine in the last couple of years alone. And I know I actually need to update this slide pictures because we've had a few more severe infrastructure damage events from high precipitation. Now, although the science is not entirely clear yet on Maine's future flood frequency with warming, if large floods became more abundant, there are thousands of jobs potentially at risk, as well as more than $1 billion of Maine's annual gross domestic product, according to the State Climate Plan's vulnerability analyses. So this is an important area that scientists are paying attention to as well. So with our warmer, shorter winters and changing precipitation patterns, Maine Won't Wait is also planning for public and ecosystem health impacts from climate change, like expanding ticks, mosquitoes, and vector-borne diseases. And Mainers can prepare for these changes through public health monitoring and education practices. A recent study in the journal Science did an interesting comparison of the impacts of climate change on generations born in 1960 versus 2020, which I wanted to show you here. This figure shows the impact of lifetime heat wave exposure, but they calculated all cumulative climate change impacts. And the study found that younger generations will experience 4 to 7 times more frequent extreme climate related events than older generations. And they also found that the exposure to these extreme climate events like heat waves or floods goes up considerably with higher degrees of warming, which are, circling back, dependent on our future emissions pathways. So even though this is all very concerning to consider, it's a lot of information in a short period of time. The science also tells us that there is time to minimize these impacts from climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned in its last assessment report that the window is closing, but we still have a bit of time to reduce our emissions to levels needed to keep our future warming to a safer low level. And by taking ambitious action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions here in Maine, we can provide leadership to other rural states and countries around the world. So Maine is taking a lot of action, which we'll talk about in the coming slides, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 and reduce our emissions to achieve these greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. So Maine, as the climate plan says, Maine is not waiting to tackle these very concerning trends. So very quickly, the information I've covered today is a very summarized version of a lot of great information provided on the Maine Climate Council website and several reports listed on this slide. There's a great deal more detail and information, so I'll be putting some links in the chat later on in the talk to give you the location of these if you want to dig in anymore. Okay. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about the state climate action plan itself, Maine Won't Wait. This plan was created by the Maine Climate Council in late 2020, and it tackles both reducing greenhouse gases as well as adapting to the impacts of climate change that we just talked about. Karina and I will be virtually passing the microphone back and forth to walk through some of the emissions saving strategies of the climate action plan and what communities can do to take action. So the Maine Climate Council in 2019 was tasked by Governor Mills and Maine's legislature to create a climate action plan that achieves the goals listed on this slide. Some of the really high level important goals that we want to focus on today are our greenhouse gas emissions targets of achieving 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. We also have a statute that directs us to create a plan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And that's really a balance between emissions going into the atmosphere from activities in Maine with carbon that's being stored in Maine's environments, our forests, our coastal ecosystems, and wetlands. In addition, the climate plan suggests strategies to make Mainers more resilient to the impacts of climate change or adaptation strategies, fostering economic opportunity and prosperity, and very importantly, advancing equity through Maine's climate response. So where do our emissions actually come from? Well, most of them come from the combustion of fossil fuels. And of our fossil fuel derived carbon dioxide emissions, the largest sources come from transportation, the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. As this slide shows, almost half of Maine's emissions come from the transportation sector, and nearly 30 or a little over 30% come from the heating, cooling, and electrification of buildings in the residential and commercial sectors. And as of 2019, Maine has reduced its gross greenhouse gases, so that's just greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, by 25% below 1990 levels. And we've been able to reduce our emissions primarily due to decreasing use of fossil fuels over time. We're getting more efficient with the things that we're doing, and a transition in our electricity generation sector towards lower carbon fossil fuels like natural gas. The Maine DEP also estimates that Maine's 75% of the way towards carbon neutrality, primarily because we have incredibly abundant forests that have been regrowing over the last century. And we have a lot of carbon being sequestered in those forests, trees, and soils, but also in Maine's wetlands. So with all this in mind, let's turn to the strategies in the state climate plan, Maine Won't Wait. The first three strategies on the left-hand side of this slide are primarily concerned with reducing emissions in some of Maine's biggest source sectors, transportation and buildings and electricity generation, and ensuring that our electricity is coming from cleaner, renewable sources. The other 5 strategies in Maine Won't Wait address growing a clean energy economy and protecting our natural resource heritage industries, adapting to the impacts of climate change, building resilient communities and infrastructure, and engaging Maine people in climate action and education. So our talk this afternoon will focus just on these first 3 strategies, A through C, which touch on embracing the future of transportation, modernizing Maine's buildings, and reducing emissions in our energy and industrial sectors. So with one last thing, and Gabe, actually, you introduced this for me really nicely before. For anybody who's reviewed the full list of community actions suggested by the Community Resilience Partnership, those 72 actions that Gabe talked about earlier, you'll recognize these strategies as guiding topics for those suggested actions. So I'm going to turn it over to Karina for a couple of slides.
Thanks, Cassie. That was a great introduction, and I just wanted to take a moment. We're about to go through a lot of the strategies from A, B, and C that the state is taking and that communities can take. But I wanted to take a moment real quick to talk about why communities in Maine should also be taking action on climate change. You know, all levels of government have a role to play in addressing climate change, and Dr. Rose has really spelled out for us what the role of the state is and what the state's plans are. But municipal action is important too, and there's a number of ways that the decisions that municipalities make have a direct and important impact on their community members. Municipalities, you are making decisions all the time that have impacts on the day-to-day lives of your community members. Municipalities decide, you know, what housing developments get built in the communities, how waste is managed, where folks in the community can park, and more. Also, beyond those day-to-day things, municipalities have long-term planning that guides where the community is going in the future. And also, municipalities are responsible for the public services that are responsible for the safety and well-being of community members. So you are really having a direct relationship with a lot of the folks of Maine, and therefore can have a lot of influence on their actions as well as the actions of the broader systems of the community. Also, because Maine is a home rule state, municipalities have a lot of authority to create local regulations that can push the state forward on climate action. Those include regulations relating to land use and zoning, and also building codes. Another thing that municipalities have is that your actions are really visible to your community members. You know, when you buy an electric vehicle or install a charging station, folks see that as they're walking and driving throughout your community. And so you have a really great opportunity to lead by example. And then finally, just to point out that municipalities can often be a bit nimbler and able to respond more quickly than a larger organization like the state. So you can really respond to your community's needs and concerns, as well as rapidly changing technologies and strategies for climate action. So to emphasize that point, the state has really ambitious and wonderful goals for climate action, and those can't be achieved without municipal support and local action as well. One other thing I wanted to bring up before we dived into specific actions is to touch upon municipal climate action planning. Just as the state has created a climate action plan, local governments in Maine are also creating their own plans for reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. Similar to the state, these plans usually start with a greenhouse gas inventory to identify the magnitude and sources of emissions. And then the plans also include goals and targets for reducing emissions and specific strategies the municipality and the community in a broader sense can take to meet those goals. So there are many communities right now that are using community action grants to undertake climate action planning. I myself am working with 5 communities here in southern Maine, 4 of which are working together to collaborate on their climate action planning efforts. One of those communities, Biddeford, they just set a goal just last month of reaching net zero by 2050 and emissions reductions of over 60% by 2030. So a lot of the municipalities are really starting to lead the way in pushing these climate action efforts forward. And once communities have created their climate action plans, the Community Resilient Partnership grants are a great way to start funding those actions. Portland, South Portland, and Cumberland have all started to receive funding through the community action grants for the strategies that they've laid out in their plans themselves. So if you're looking for where to get started, sometimes thinking holistically and creating a plan can be helpful. All right, so with that, those few points, I think we can move on to starting to dive into a little bit of the specific strategies, if you'd like to take it over.
Yeah, thanks. So the first strategy tackles the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Maine, transportation, which is responsible for 49% of Maine's annual CO2 emissions. So this strategy is really around embracing the future of transportation in Maine through a number of different ways. It seeks to accelerate our transition to electric vehicles by setting a goal of achieving 41,000 light-duty electric vehicles on the road by 2025 and 219,000 by 2030, which help to the state to achieve those emissions reductions goals we talked about before. And this strategy also recommends ways to reduce vehicle miles traveled with our current vehicles on the road, with strategies such as increasing access to high-speed internet, improved land use and remote work policies, improved public transportation, and much more. There's a lot of detail in here that we aren't able to cover today that are listed in Maine Won't Wait. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of where the state of Maine is at in achieving these goals. So currently Maine has 8,594 or so electric vehicles, light-duty electric vehicles on the road in Maine as of this October. This is growing quickly over time. However, we still have quite a ways to go to reach our goal of 45,000 vehicles on the road by 2025. The state of Maine is also dedicating considerable funds to the state budget, as well as directing some of the opportunities from recent federal funds coming into the state to expand electric vehicle charging. And this map, it's a little bit fuzzy, shows some of the more than 389 charging stations that currently exist throughout the state. And many more are coming and built along priority corridors, which will be funded through federal funds coming to the state. So we've seen an increase over time, and this will continue to increase to allow both individuals and municipalities to take advantage of charging throughout the state. We also have some recent wins for Maine, for example, from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency's Clean School Bus Program. The EPA recently made, I believe it was $1 billion available to all 50 states to completely fund the purchase of electric school buses as well as charging equipment. And Maine ranked 4th in the country per capita for bus awards. We have 34 buses coming to Maine, as shown on this map here. And this is a picture of the very first electric school bus that came to Maine, which came last year on Mount Desert Islands High School. So there are more rounds of EPA funding. They have 5 years of funding planned, with, I believe the next year is bumped up again to $1 billion. So there are significant federal opportunities to municipalities to contribute towards this goal, and to have their the transition of their school bus fleets funded through these federal opportunities. So I'll turn it back over to Karina.
Thanks. Yeah, so digging in a bit more into what specifically municipalities can do to help reduce emissions from transportation. First, the sort of broad category that municipalities can look to is to support the electrification of the transportation system. And specifically, one thing that's been very popular is leading by example with the municipal fleet. So purchasing EVs for your municipal fleet is a great way to take advantage of the incentives that are out there to procure new vehicles for your municipality at a lower cost, and also have lower lifetime costs for the vehicles, but also a way to show your support for vehicle electrification in a really public way. Having an electric police vehicle or a fire rescue vehicle, like the one shown here, is a very visible way to kind of prove to the community that EVs work, and that your community supports them. So community action grants have been popular for purchasing electric vehicles. Communities have been combining community action grants with efficiency Maine incentives to reduce the cost of EVs and updating municipal fleets. Another action municipalities can take is to install EV charging stations at public sites. This is also a pretty popular activity, and Carrabassett Valley just got a community action grant to install EV charging stations at their outdoor center. So that's another way to sort of publicly signal your municipal support for EVs and to make sure that there's charging infrastructure available for folks who are visiting your community. There are other ways that municipalities can support vehicle electrification that are sort of broader and more long-term projects. One is to work collaboratively to develop charging infrastructure throughout the community, such as at workplaces or multi-unit dwellings. I have linked here that you'll be able to see when the slides are shared, the Maine Clean Communities Empower program, which is a new program to help develop workplace charging initiatives in Maine communities. And then finally, the last action to mention here is that a significant step municipality can take is to adopt an EV infrastructure ordinance, an ordinance that might require or encourage EV infrastructure to be installed in new parking facilities. Linked here is South Portland's recently passed EV infrastructure ordinance, which is the first in the state to make requirements for EV charging infrastructure and equipment to be included in parking facilities. Another thing that communities can do to reduce transportation emissions is to promote and facilitate transit systems as well as bike and pedestrian networks by encouraging folks to not drive their cars, but instead use some alternative form of transportation. You can reduce the amount of gasoline that is being burned and fossil fuels emitted. So there's lots of different actions communities can do to promote alternative transportation. Not so many community action grants have been focused on this so far, but things like developing bike and pedestrian plans, partnering with the local transit agencies. There's a few communities here in Southern Maine that have worked hard to try and expand transit, especially for their more vulnerable and elderly populations. Kennebunk is a good example of that. They have two different sort of pilot programs going right now to try and connect carless residents with the services they need. You can adopt a complete streets policy, which ensures that streets are designed not just for cars, but also to be accessible for all members of the community, whether they're walking or biking or transporting in some other form. Dover Foxcroft actually got a community action grant to do a complete streets policy this fall. And then lastly, communities can work to encourage transit-oriented and compact or mixed-use development. This is for communities that have, more dense centers where there's a lot of mixed-use development, a lot of folks living in close quarters and not a lot of places to drive. Biddeford Saco has done a lot of work on transit-oriented development down in their more mill focused downtown parts of their community. So that's just a few examples. There are many other projects that communities are doing, and we'll be providing resources after this webinar, as well as all this slideshow with all of these links so that you can look farther. But I will pass it back to Dr. Rose to look into the next strategy.
Thanks. So that brings us to the second largest category of Maine emissions, which is in Maine's building sector, particularly residential buildings. So strategy B is around modernizing Maine's buildings, and there are a lot of sub goals listed here, but they group around a couple of different themes, including electrifying our building heating and cooling, making buildings more efficient so that they use less energy in the first place, both new and renovating existing buildings, and using climate-friendly materials. But then we have some interesting strategies such as leading by example in publicly funded buildings. This is both state as well as recommended at the municipal level. And a couple of wonky things like a renewable fuel standard and reducing hydrofluorocarbons or super greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at the price of heating over time, this is a diagram that just shows the price per BTU of different types of heating sources, such as fossil fuel driven sources, electric baseboards, a natural gas furnace, and then electric heat pumps. And what the Maine Governor's Energy Office has found is that heat pumps have been consistently the lowest cost to operate technology over time. So this strategy in Maine Won't Wait set a goal of achieving 100,000 new heat pumps in Maine buildings by 2025. And Maine has actually been leading the nation in our heat pump deployment. So these lower cost, more efficient ways of heating and cooling our homes save greenhouse gas emissions. And we're well on the way of achieving our goal of 100,000 by 2025, reaching over 80,000 in 2022 alone. And this is rapidly accelerating over time. We're also seeing great growth and as part of investment from Efficiency Maine and Maine Housing in the installation of heat pumps in low-income housing as well, where the differential energy burden from heating is often most acute. So the heat pump deployment throughout Maine has been really throughout the state. This is the number of heat pumps rebated or rebates given by Efficiency Maine per 100 population per zip code, and we find that heat pumps are really being adopted throughout the state of Maine, which is great news for achieving emissions reductions in this strategy area. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Karina to talk more about this strategy.
Great, yes, now that's a great overview. And now to talk a little bit more about specific things municipalities can do to reduce emissions from buildings. So these sort of fall into three categories. The first is to focus on electrifying and increasing energy efficiency of municipal buildings. So this is pretty straightforward, and a lot of municipalities are very excited to work on improving their own facilities that are inefficient and expensive to heat and keep operating. So municipal energy efficiency and electrification upgrades have been very popular for community action grants. In the fall 2022 grant round, a lot of communities applied for activities like the first one here, conducting an energy audit of municipal facilities. So understanding what your energy use is, and then implementing energy efficiency actions to reduce that energy use. A lot of communities are also installing heat pumps in municipal facilities. Like Cassie mentioned, they're very low cost and easy to install. And so it's been a great way to upgrade municipal heating systems. And then also communities can look into thinking about what the energy use that their future buildings will be. A lot of municipalities right now are thinking about either extensively renovating or building new town halls, community centers, other municipal facilities. So one way to ensure that those facilities are also heated through electric sources like heat pumps and are as efficient as possible is to create a policy that requires that those new municipal facilities are going to be green. For example, the town of York has an article in their zoning ordinance that requires all municipal buildings to meet the most up-to-date International Energy Conservation Code. That's the IECC 2021. So that they're the most energy efficient possible given today's current technology. So something to think about going forward as you're thinking not only of your current buildings, but of your future buildings. So beyond focusing on municipal buildings, municipalities can also encourage, incentivize, or even require energy efficiency in new and existing buildings. This is certainly a harder and longer term strategy that's only starting to be considered by communities in Maine. But one way you can require new buildings to be more energy efficiency is to adopt the Maine Stretch Energy Code. So right now, all Maine communities are required to meet the basic energy code, which is the IECC 2015. But Maine communities are allowed to adopt a stretch code that goes above and beyond the energy efficiency requirements that are basically required. And that is that IECC 2021 code currently, which the Department of Energy has determined that's 10% more efficient than the Maine base code. And both the city of Portland and South Portland have adopted this stretch code for their community. So all new buildings built in their communities will be required to meet this more stringent energy efficient code. Another way municipalities can encourage larger commercial and residential buildings to be more energy efficient is by requiring benchmarking. So that's where large commercial and residential facilities are required to measure and track their energy use over time, with the idea that tracking energy use will encourage those building owners to make improvements and reduce their energy use and reduce their overall costs. South Portland has an energy and water benchmarking ordinance currently in place for the large facilities in their community. And then one step above benchmarking is implementing a building performance standard. Don't need to get into this too much, but basically it makes benchmarking a requirement as well as then reducing your energy use or your greenhouse gas emissions from a baseline over time for those large facilities. And no one in Maine currently does this, but it's something that is starting to be done in a lot of cities throughout the country, so might become more important in the future. And then finally, communities can encourage their community members and their businesses to incorporate energy efficiency measures through activities like weatherize campaigns. So outreach events trying to encourage folks to weatherize their homes or their businesses, and window dressers, which is a very popular weatherization nonprofit, got a community action grant this fall to do a weatherization campaign with Eastport and Pleasant Point up in Washington County. And then finally, for building energy use, you can also encourage, incentivize, encourage and incentivize the electrification of existing and new buildings. So not just encouraging energy efficiency, but also encouraging electrification. If your community is considering adopting the stretch code, that does encourage electrification of buildings as well. And also the stretch code has a net zero appendix that can be adopted to encourage the incorporation of solar panels and other renewable energy technologies into building design for new buildings. And then many communities in Maine are starting to create electrification incentive programs, whether those might be additional grants for heat pumps, especially for low-income residents, as well as sort of an Electrify Everything campaign where communities have grants for heat pumps, but they also have grants for things like electric lawn mowers and electric bikes, and just trying to encourage people to get excited about electric technology in all aspects of their homes and businesses. And so I think that's my last example for the building sector. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Rose to talk about strategy C.
Great. Thanks, Karina. And I wanted to add one additional tidbit here, which is that the federal government recently passed a large bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which significantly enhances federal incentives to do things like install heat pumps, but also has tax rebates for improving energy efficiency in buildings. And so the Maine Climate Council is monitoring this, and I believe state agencies like Efficiency Maine will be also monitoring that as how to see how that can be combined with state and even local incentives. So I think the incentives are really improving beginning January 1st, and that can be a great opportunity both for municipalities and members of your communities. Wonderful. So our last strategy that we're talking about today is strategy C in Maine Won't Wait, which is focusing on reducing emissions in our energy and industrial sectors through clean energy innovation. And so this really is about ensuring that Maine has adequate, affordable, clean energy supplies to help power all of the electrification that the other strategies are recommending. And this strategy helps get towards the requirement that Maine achieve by 2030 an electricity grid where at least 80% of our electricity usage is coming from renewable generation and 100% by 2050, something called the renewable portfolio standard. And so there are a number of strategies here, but I wanted to, or sub-strategies, but I wanted to report a little bit on how we're doing on achieving this goal. So over the last 2 years, Maine has seen a large expansion in solar generation as one example of renewable energy generation since 2020, particularly with smaller scale distributed solar installations of 5 megawatts or less. We can see here that as of September 2022, we reached 545 megawatts through solar generation, or solar installed capacity. The governor's energy office has done analysis that shows that increases in renewables like solar coming online in Maine over the last couple of years have also helped to bring down some of the cost increases in electricity in Maine, which have gone up significantly as they have around the country and around the world. And renewable energy sources like solar can represent a much less volatile source of energy in your community than global fossil fuel markets, which have been significantly disrupted during the last year due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine and continued impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. So now I'm going to turn it back to Karina.
Thanks. So in the world of renewable energy development and reducing emissions in Maine energy and industrial sectors, the role of municipalities can play is a little smaller compared to the building and residential, the building and transportation sectors, just because, you know, energy production is sort of outside the realm of what's happening in our communities normally. But there's a lot that communities can do to enable and support the development of renewable energy, especially rooftop or local small scale solar. So many municipalities have received community action grants to install solar for municipal energy use, and some even solar and battery for municipal energy use at municipal and tribal facilities. So pictured here is a solar array from Manchester, and a lot of communities are installing solar on town halls as well as police and fire stations. When that solar is combined with a battery, especially at critical facilities, then that renewable energy serves a dual purpose of supporting the resilience of the community in case of power outages or other community hazardous events where that energy is a backup and keeps public services operating even despite challenges with the grid. So beyond installing solar power, municipalities can also work to try and get renewable energy or other clean energy businesses into their community, either through creating incentives or promoting tax increment finance districts for development. One interesting example in Sanford, they've created the virtual Sanford Renewable Energy Corridor, which connects clean energy businesses to solar power. That is being developed on a brownfield site. So trying to think of creative ways to get clean energy businesses into your community. Another important tool municipalities have through their land use ordinances is to regulate the location of larger solar developments in their community, making sure that there's opportunity for solar development to happen where it makes sense and is appropriate, but also making sure that it does not come at the cost of other parts of the community that are important, such as agricultural farms or sites or valuable ecosystems. So the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry has a really helpful agricultural solar siting resources page that has all the information you need to know about thinking about how solar can be thoughtfully sited in a community. But certainly creating some sort of renewable energy ordinance can help clarify and streamline the process of having larger solar development in your community. And then finally, municipalities can sort of play a coordinating and encouraging role for the development of renewable energy at brownfield sites. So these are contaminated and often underutilized properties in the community. A few communities have done solar on capped landfills, so old landfills that are no longer in use, as well as working to creatively install solar at old schools that are being converted into affordable housing facilities, metal recycling facilities. Basically any site that doesn't have a very good purpose otherwise is a great place to think about siting solar energy. And then the last page of examples that we'll give to you is that municipalities can also work to assist with access to affordable renewable energy. So as Dr. Rose already mentioned, the cost of energy is certainly becoming an increasing burden on Maine residents and community members. And so making sure that as the transition to solar and other renewable energy is happening, that energy remains accessible and affordable to your community members, and especially low-income community members. So things you can do to support that is to work to streamline the processes in your community for having rooftop solar installed. That could be the permitting process. You could streamline it, reduce barriers, reduce permitting fees for rooftop solar, as well as making sure that your zoning and other building codes do not prohibit or create barriers for putting rooftop solar on. One great program for identifying the ways your community can promote rooftop solar is called SolSmart. They're a national nonprofit supported by the Department of Energy that helps communities work through a checklist to figure out how their community can support rooftop solar. And Topsom just this year achieved a SolSmart bronze designation for working on their permitting processes and reviewing their ordinances. Another thing communities can do is support access to community solar, whether that's just providing education to community members about the many different community solar options that are now available in Maine, to actually working to create a community solar farm in your community. On Mount Desert Island, there is a community solar farm where local homeowners actually own the solar farm itself and benefit from the energy produced there. And then finally, your municipality can work with local businesses to reduce the cost of rooftop solar for households and small businesses. So that's really working on creating incentives or discounts for communities through things like a Solarize campaign, which is basically a campaign where you can get a bunch of homeowners together to purchase solar for their roofs and get a reduced cost from a local solar installer as a result. So that's more of an outreach and education activity, as well as sort of facilitating, connecting your residents and businesses to the incentives and programs that are out there, like the new increased federal tax credit for solar that is going into effect in 2023 as well. So that's the last of my examples. I know there's been a lot. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to add those to the chat. Or if you want to talk any more about these specific actions or examples of these actions, happy to talk about those as well. But I will pass it back over to Dr. Rose to wrap us up.
Thanks very much. There's so many great examples of action going on for all three of these strategies. It's been really exciting to listen. So we pulled together just a few resources in addition to all of the great links already mentioned to learn more. So last year, my office launched MaineWon'tWait.org as a public-facing website about Maine's climate action plan. And this could be a resource to all of you personally or in talking with members of your community about climate change and climate action. So it has clear, easy to understand explanations and visualizations of climate change impacts and data, what the state climate plan actually is and does, and connects Maine people, businesses, and communities with ways to support the goals of Maine Won't Wait. So that's MaineWon'tWait.org. Many of the updates that I've mentioned today and so much more on progress in putting Maine Won't Wait into action in communities around the state can be found in interactive maps and visualizations on the dashboard at MaineWon'tWait.org. So the full link is there, but if you type in MaineWon'tWait.org and then go to the dashboard, you can see this interactive map. And you can also find information about the recipients of community action grants around the state on the dashboard at MaineWon'tWait.org or at the Community Resilience Partnership website itself, which we'll drop a link to in the chat. So thank you so much for your attention during this holiday week, in between holiday week. And we're really happy to take your questions and chat in the time that we have left. Handing it back to Gabe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, and thank you so much, Karina. Really appreciate all of the information, and I learned a lot, so thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, before we jump into questions, again, the slides, the recording, all of that information will be shared with you. We'll send out an email by tomorrow that has all that information. And I just wanted to put another link in the chat just to say that, again, this is one in a series of many, many Building Stronger Communities presentations that we'll be doing over the coming months. And also wanted to put a plug in for MMA, Maine Municipal Association, is hosting webinars coming up starting in January around the bipartisan infrastructure law funding opportunities that are available. And I'll drop a link in the chat that gets you to a document, and don't mind that it says for enrolled communities. It's for anyone who wants to attend, but this will give you a list of all of the upcoming Building Stronger Communities workshops, as well as the Maine Municipal Association workshops, and registration links are included in that as well. And just a plug for our next Building Stronger Communities workshop, it will be about different how communities have pooled together funding opportunities for their larger scale projects and different projects that they're doing. So using a community action grant along with other multiple funding sources. And that's going to be on Tuesday, January 10th from 10 to 11. That information is in the document that is linked to the URL that I just provided. So since we have so few folks on the call, we had originally intended to just do questions from the chat initially, but let's just do it verbally because we are a nice small group here, and that will just make it go better and give everyone a chance to share if they need to or would like to. So if you have questions, thoughts, comments, anything you want to share, please, come on video, just unmute and go ahead and share. I'm not seeing any so far, but I'll give folks a chance to come on, come off of mute. If you want to come on video, that's great. Not seeing any, but we will just assume that if you have questions, you can follow up with us. You will get everyone's email in the information that we send out from this presentation. So feel free to follow up with Dr. Rose or Karina or myself. And we really appreciate you taking the time today, as Dr. Rose mentioned, during what is usually a busy post and then another pre-holiday week. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.